switched off? And can everybody please switch their microphone on when speaking and then turn it off when finishing speaking? I'd like to welcome Dan Harrison to the committee, and I'd like to thank Councillor Fillimore for standing in for Bill Lickorish, and I am aware that Mrs Broadley has got a personal emergency, so she may or may not be able to join us. So I think if we can obviously record it, if not, but I know that she would be here if she could. So we'll start off with item 1, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of November. Do I have a proposer? Seconder? All in favour? Thank you. Right, item 2 is question time. I've received no questions from members of the public. Item 3, I've received no questions from members, apart from one that we will take during the agenda as it relates directly to an agenda item. Agenda item 4, I've been notified of no items that are urgent. Agenda item 5, are there any declarations of interest members wish to make? Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a declaration regarding agenda item 10 and Appendix A. As my wife's carer, I am in receipt of some monies from the County Council. They pay direct to the organisation and I pay the final bill every month. My wife is suffering from dementia, hence that situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dan. Any other members? No, right, thank you for that. Agenda item 6, there are no declarations from the party whip. Agenda item 7, there is no presentation of petitions under Standing Order 36. We will then start on the substance of the meeting, which is agenda item 8, which is the medium-term financial strategy 2021 to 2023-24, which is on pages 13 to 36. Members will have received a supplemental sheet that looks like this, which is how we're going to go through the agenda. So we will take it as normal in chunks for the report, and then members would ask questions at the end of each subsection. Could I also welcome both the cabinet holder and their support worker for coming here to be questioned, and they may wish to interject as well. So we will start off with you, John.
Thank you, Chair. So the first section, paragraphs 6 to 12 on service transformation, just outline the strategic direction of the department. As committee will know, and as we've previously reported to committee, we are consulting on a new adults and community strategy, bringing together the various different arms of the department into a single strategic document, the ambitions of which are outlined in paragraph 7. And we will, of course, continue to work with our colleagues in the NHS and district and borough councils to develop integrated health, housing and social care services. And that's the basis upon which we've drawn up the MTFS document for today.
Anyone got any questions on that part so far? Right, thank you.
The next section is details the proposed revenue budget. And this is taken into various different sections, and we'll go through each section individually. So the first element, paragraphs 13 to 19, outline the summary position for the revenue budget. So paragraph 13 has a table spanning 2020 to 2024 with the proposed revenue budgets. As you will see, the proposed revenue budget for 2021 is the net position is £143 million. That's made up of a £241 million gross budget, with income and other contributions of £98.5 million. And paragraph 15 details the breakdown of the net spend for the department. Paragraph 16 outlines the budget transfers of just under £10 million, which took place in 1920, which then impact on the 2021 starting position. And as you'll see, the vast majority of those transfers are in connection with price inflation and the residential nursing care fee increase. Growth and savings we'll take separately in the next two sections, but just to note that there is an identification by each growth and each saving of any changes from previous reports to committee and whether or not we're looking at service reductions or efficiencies.
Thank you, John. Richard, is there anything you wish to say at this time? No. Any members? Mr Mayor.
Cheers. Thank you, Chair. On the chart, paragraph 13, it shows net budget expenditure 143 going up to 147 million pounds by 23-24 year. Has the government increase in the council tax base helped the department cushion some of the austerity measures that we had, or could we do with a bit more? And if so, what are the challenges facing us funding going forward?
Okay, that sounds like a discussion question. It's a 2,000-word essay. Certainly, the government's allowance for local authorities to increase the council tax base with a specific adult social care precept obviously helps the council in terms of its ability to meet ongoing demand. And as you'll see, it's not just the demographic demand, and I suppose what I would say is that the tables that you have in front of you are the proposed budgets based on our estimates of demographic and growth pressures. What they don't include, other than for the 2021 budget, are the cost pressures, the inflation and price and cost pressures. And you'll see that if we just look at 2021, the budget transfers, £9.3 million of price inflation vastly outstrips the demographic growth pressure. So price pressure and cost pressure are currently have a much bigger impact on social care budget than demographic growth. And they're not factored in for the future years. So if you were to factor those across the next 3, 4, 5 years, you would see at least another £40 million worth of growth on those budgets. So yes, it absolutely does help the council to meet those pressures. Is it sustainable in the long term? Personal view would be that asking local taxation to pay for social care is not a sustainable solution. That would be my personal view, and I think it helps in the short term, but as a long-term measure, we probably need a new funding settlement.
In the absence of any further questions, Sean, if you want to carry on.
So, moving on to elements of growth. Paragraph 20. Total growth for 2021 is estimated at 2.8 million, rising to 9.2 million over the 4 years. The first thing to say is that these are projections that are based on the information that we have going through the last financial year, and obviously these are subject to change over the 4-year period. The first element is older people's demand-led growth, £975,000 in the next financial year, rising to 4.4 million by the end of the MTFS plan. These accounted for mainly by increases in the acuity of older adults. So by acuity, what we mean is the level of need. So it's not so much that there are going to be lots of extra people in the population. We know that the older population is going to increase. We know that demographic growth is going to be prevalent over the period. But actually, the majority of this increase is due to the fact that it's not just the numbers of people, it's the level of need that individuals have. So we have more people living longer with multiple long-term conditions, and that gives rise to a greater need for social care. The next element is learning disability demand of just over £1 million next year. This is accounted for by the numbers of young people with disabilities who transition into adult services from children and young people's services, as well as the fact that people with complex multiple disabilities are living longer into older age, and therefore there is a longer term impact for social care. And then paragraphs 24 and 25 detail mental health and physical disabilities, which, as you'll see, have a lower level of demand-led expenditure of 315,000 and 115,000 respectively. In addition to the demographic growth We've put specific provision in, as we have in previous years, for what's called transforming care. So this is the transforming care programme. These are people with learning disabilities, autism and mental health needs who are currently living in hospital accommodation, who require separate accommodation and care in the community. And paragraphs 26 through to 31 just outline the narrative and the evidence base upon which we've outlined that £360,000. And then finally, paragraph 32, under growth, there's a small element of growth to support the continued implementation of the smart libraries, and this is just to cover some of the CCTV costs that are associated with that provision.
Mr. Mayor.
Cheers, thank you. I welcome all the growth because it's planned for and is better to plan to deliver. A lot of it seems to be in the adult part of our brief and the social care part of our brief, I should say. Even though the small amount that's in the communities aspect is in the libraries, I am disappointed that there isn't more for our communities out there, and maybe in future years we could look at that part of our committee and see what we are doing and how we can grow our community aspect.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure we could have a report back on work that's taking place within communities. Of course, much of the work that takes place in communities is not necessarily in the Adults and Communities Department. So it's a bit of a misnomer, I accept. But so colleagues in public health, for example, will have a lot of investment in community development. Chief Executives Department have a community development section. So there's actually quite a lot of work corporately across the council, and it may be that it's more a report for a Scrutiny Commission rather than for a single committee, because actually it will cross-cut a number of different, probably all of our committees actually. And the Health and Wellbeing Board clearly take reports regularly on community development activity. We can detail the work that's happening in this department, but it might be that we'd want to bring it together with colleagues in other departments to get a whole picture of the work that the council is doing.
Well, you're getting away easily today, John. If we can move on to savings. So paragraphs 33 through to 45 detail the savings and efficiencies. The first element there is individual long-term residential placement costs. This is a continuation of an existing MTFS line that we've had in place for 2 or 3 years, and I think this is the final year that this will be in the MTFS under the current MTFS line. £250,000, so around reviewing high-cost placements. The next one, AC2, is the departmental contribution to the corporate efficiency saving to address the additional costs of staff absence over and above the corporate target, and the departmental contribution there is outlined at £165,000 for 2021. The next one is increased service user income. Again, we've seen this in previous MTFS lines, and is accounted for through additional chargeable income as the DWP increases pensions and benefit payments to people. That means that as a social care authority, we can increase the charges that we make for services because people have more disposable income. AC4 is called Place to Live. This is a particular saving from the development of the Brookfield supported living service in Great Glen. So we've invested in a property. We'll be looking to provide people with accommodation from April of this year, and there's a saving to the adult social care revenue budget of £50,000. This is a part year saving against that. But there's in addition to the adult social care saving, there's also a saving which will be included in the corporate resources MTFS savings of £150,000 from rental income. And then AC5 is
Not new, but it's a significant increase in the saving on the departmental MTFS. So we're now putting in a £5 million saving against the target operating model, which we've reported to committee on a couple of occasions. So we've been investing throughout the last 12 months to develop the model and to begin the implementation, and from 2021 we should see the revenue savings starting to come through. So there's £5 million in 2021, rising to £6 million in 21-22. And the table of opportunities is outlined again at paragraph 40, which shows the total opportunity available, and paragraph 42, there's some detail there around the level of cashable saving and the expectation that we should be able to meet the £6 million by 2021. And then finally, there's an element of reduced financial growth due to demand management improvements, and a slight addition, a new one actually, additional better care fund. So this is an income line, and it relates to the fact that the better care fund, which is money that comes through from the NHS to support the delivery of social care services, received a higher annual uplift than was originally anticipated during the last financial year. So that provides us with additional income to the department.
Right. In the absence of hands, I'd just like to comment actually on AC5. I think we should acknowledge as a committee the bold decision taken by Cabinet to, in conjunction with our officers, to go this route. And the savings it's having, this committee has had two excellent presentations from the teams that are doing this. And I think it does go to show that, you know, if a council's bold enough to take a look at itself using independent people, what can be achieved. So I think it would be wrong not to congratulate the officers and cabinet members on taking this decision and the impact it's had on this budget. We're not talking small figures here, but for this happening, we would have been trying to find another 5 million. So I just want to put that on record. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to comment on AC5 as well, because it's a substantial amount of money, and I know we touched on it a couple of times before. You've implemented it. The delivery savings will be coming forward. Is it on target, do you think, to deliver 5 million and then 6 million? And if so, over target or there or thereabouts?
The latest figures that we can see coming through the start of the implementation, we've only just started to implement the new target operating model, do indicate that we will achieve the 5 to 6 million, and we are hopeful there may be some more, but it's too early to say because we still haven't fully implemented all the new ways of working across all the department. Perhaps if we're lucky, we might be able to find a bit more than the 6 million.
Will we get a report, say, in 6 months or a year's time, maybe say 6 months' time, to see how it's going and if the savings are being achieved? Because it is one of the biggest savings I've seen in any corporate plan at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, the intention is to continue to bring regular reports here on how we're doing, so yes, you'll see that.
Rich, I think you indicated you'd like to come in.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting this. If we'd gone through this report and not mentioned AC5, it would have been very sad. I think it shows how comfortable we all are. It's incredibly... until you'd met them and met the presentation of how they're going to go about it, you'd say from the outside that shouldn't be possible to do that, to do a better job, to do the job in a more efficient way with better outcomes and make a saving has been the thing that I've said consistently. I was elected at the age of 30 years ago, nearly, and this is the most exciting thing I've ever been involved in. It shouldn't be this good, but it is, and if it goes into children's as well, it'll be amazing. Just in terms of the outcomes, on Joel's comments, why I joined in, is we're watching it very carefully. It really is big numbers, and it is, but it's small decisions. It's lots and lots of small decisions, lots and lots of individual cases being looked at one by one. I've said it before, but the two people to my right equally are absolutely on top of this. It doesn't mean they're going to have all the answers, but they're watching it second by second as it happens, and they are as keen as you are to see the good outcomes. But I say it is really it's a pleasure to do this job with these two people on the right here, because this is an amazing future for all local government, really.
Thank you, Richard. I wouldn't have let you snuck through without mentioning AC5. It would be wrong to not mention a figure like that, and the implications it has, as you correctly say, for other areas of the council that could potentially benefit as much as we appear to be benefiting already in adults and communities. Short one now, John, communities and wellbeing savings.
Yes, thank you. So moving on to paragraph 46, AC8, implementation of the revised service for community and wellbeing. So the first element is to do with the restructure of the community and wellbeing service, which will start shortly, actually, with an HR action plan at the end of this month for implementation through the summer. There's a part year saving in 2021, and then the full saving comes through by 22-23. And then a very small element which follows through in 22-23, subject to the second phase of the Record Office Collections Hub being taken forward, which could provide a further £40,000 of revenue saving should that second phase be taken forward.
Do we have any indication, John, of the time scale for phase 2?
Well, as it says in here, at the moment we're looking at 22-23. Obviously that depends on phase 1 and on phase 1 being developed successfully and to time. And then a further conversation on phase 2 in terms of whether or not we want to go forward with the current proposed plan, or whether in fact we want to amend that plan over the sort of next 2-3 years.
Richard?
Yeah, I think also to add to that, it does link into property a huge amount. And I have to say, again, at a recent lead member meeting, I commented on the fact that we have a very good relationship with property. They're very intuitive. They can pick up a whole range of issues, as you've seen on investments in adult social care, buildings, things like that. They're very good, but obviously in some ways, some of our outcomes are linked to some of their choices. And we're not in charge of property, it's a different department. I say we work very closely. I've got no complaints about it. If I did, I'd take it to Byron, who's head of the property portfolio. But some of the things do depend on their choices and their decisions. So that's why it's a little bit more variable, but that's why it's a relatively simple, not a small amount, not a big figure here. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Mayor?
Cheers, thank you, Chair. Looking at that 310,000, but ultimately 410,000 in paragraph 47, and when you see the words human resources as well, and restructuring, is that a lot of money to, make people redundant? Is that ultimately what it is?
It's certainly a lot of money. It's a lot of money for this particular service area. This service area has an overall net budget of around £5 million. So yes, it's significant, nearly 10% of the service area budget. There will be obviously reductions in posts. That's where the money comes from. It's too early to say. We haven't gone through the action plan yet, so we can't say what the level of redundancies would be, or whether any of those redundancies would be voluntary or compulsory. We can't say at this time. But clearly it will have an impact on the service.
Thank you, John. Paragraphs 51 to 59.
So 51 to 59 are what we've termed savings under development. So this is a recognition that if you look at the overall council's MTFS position, there is still a gap by year 4, as detailed in the report, of £19 million. And therefore further savings will have to be brought forward within the next 4 years to meet that gap. There are 2 areas that are outlined in the report today. The first is the social care investment plan, which we previously termed Place to Live within the MTFS. The investment plan has been reported to committee on a couple of occasions. We are intending to, wherever possible, work with partners to develop accommodation with care, which potentially then will provide a revenue saving for the authority over the course of the next 5, 10 and 20 years. The council invested the first £10 million following a report to Cabinet in October 2019, and we are already beginning to invest that capital in a number of schemes. The ability of the investment plan to deliver additional MTFS savings will certainly in the first 1 or 2 years be offset by the target operating model, because there is between the investment plan and the target operating model, there's quite a lot of duplication in some of the areas of practice. So the first sort of 1 or 2 years of savings against, for example, developing supported living will be recorded against the target operating model rather than the investment plan. So we'll be using the investment plan to purchase and develop properties, but the revenue savings that are attached from that will go against the target operating model, because the target operating model is seeking to provide people with more independent outcomes. But nevertheless, over the course of the whole of the MTFS, we would expect to see there being some level of saving attracting to the investment plan once we've gone beyond the operating model outcomes. And then the second area is digital technology. So we're doing some work at the moment to scope the level of ambition that we should have for introducing digital technology, care tech as it's called, to support individuals, provide alternatives to traditional means of support, but also provide people with easier access to health and social care. We've looked at what's happening in other authorities, where we're doing some work again, utilising some external partners to help us to identify the opportunities, and we'd expect over the course of the next 12 to 24 months to be bringing forward some ideas about where we could use technology more efficiently and more effectively to provide people with care and support.
Mrs. Wright.
On paragraph 53, we talk about the social care investment plan, and the most significant cost is adult social care is for residential placement. So we're trying to reduce that, the number of people placed in residential care, and increase the number supported in community setting. How realistic is that going forward with an ageing population? Because I know now that, we, like you were referring to, people are getting older, living older with complex needs. But there comes a point where supported community setting is no longer feasible, because we're seeing people, I just happened to be carol singing in a residential care home at Christmas, and one lady there was 105. So it's, and the only reason she was in the care home was because she'd come there within a few months, because she just felt she couldn't cope any longer, but she was 105. And I'm just wondering, with that climb, how realistic is that?
I think that's a very fair question. I think there'll be a balance. So clearly, as the population of people aged over 80, over 90, over 100 increases, then the chances are that the level of frailty in the population will also increase naturally. And clearly there will always be a requirement for residential and nursing care provision, undoubtedly. I think that we can still do more to support some people to stay at home for longer. So it might be that the average age of admission will increase. So currently, I'm not sure what the average age of admission is, but last time we looked, it was sort of in the mid-80s. Certainly, 10 years ago, that would have been in the mid-70s. And that, so there's still potentially propensity there to improve that. And we obviously want to support people at home for as long as possible. I think that there are still people who are going into residential care possibly for the wrong reasons. I think sometimes people get the wrong advice. And I think that some people could be supported at home and they live at home for longer. And actually, the majority of people would wish that. The vast majority of people would wish that. Not everybody, because some, but the vast majority of people wish that. I think one of the areas that we'd want to do more is providing information, advice and guidance to people who fund their own care. Because I think, we know that we only commission about 30% of the care market in Leicestershire, about 65-70% of the care market is either provided through health or through people funding their own care. And I think we could probably support people to stay at home who might be making choices without necessarily seeking our advice. So I think there are potential there.
I think one of the reasons quite a few people go into residential care is the fact that they can no longer cope at night on their own. So we put daycare, we can put 3 or 4 calls in a day, but the element that pushes people into residential care is the fact that at night they have no care. I mean, are we looking at trying to develop that more in the community to be able to stop people, going into residential care because of that element?
Yes, is the simple answer. I think there are the 3 main reasons why people tend to enter care are, as you say, because of nighttime needs, because of needs around continence care, and for reasons of dementia and other associated cognitive impairment. Within the next report that we've got on today's agenda, there's procurement of home care services. As part of that procurement, we'll be looking at what we're calling specialised services. So there's the normal general sort of day-to-day home care, and then there'll be a number of specialist services that will sit on top, and one of the specialist services is nighttime support. So we're doing some work now to try to identify what the level of demand and the level of need is for that nighttime support.
Mike?
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the kind of digital technology review, I know that everyone's aware that the digital kind of march is something that I think can demonstrate some fantastic improvements for people. But just to be aware that in some of the conversations we're having, there's a kind of a growing community of the digitally excluded, and I think that's the assumption that kind of people who are kind of from an older generation that are getting to use technology, it's more from a social media, that kind of side of things, and a general kind of awareness and understanding of the larger digital technology just isn't as established as people are assuming. So just to make sure that more people aren't left behind as kind of things move more digitally.
Yeah, well, I obviously echo that. I mean, I think I struggle sometimes with the notion that older people are not digitally aware, because I think actually that was probably the case maybe 10 years ago. I'm not sure it's quite such the case anymore. But equally, I do take the point that some people will not have access or have access to digital equipment. Then we would have to consider that, and they certainly wouldn't have the same level of skills as my children or I feel quite digitally unaware myself sometimes. I think there are different ways of addressing that. So some of the digital technology that we'll be looking at is what you might call passive. So it just sits in the background. It does its job. People don't need to do anything with it. It'll provide monitoring, etc. I think we are only really now touching the sides of what will become commonplace in a few years' time. So I talk to health colleagues, and they're talking about digital kind of technology improvements that can provide vital monitoring and can update remotely on health conditions without the person even knowing they're doing it. I think what we're seeing now is just the start of a real digital revolution in health and social care. The key thing that we need to do is to ensure that we don't replace what is a crucial element of personalisation with technology. So we have to make sure that we balance using technology for its best purposes, but not isolating people without kind of human contact. I think that's the key to it, really.
Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you. I agree with everything people have said, but I think also science and technology, not only digitally, but assistance for people who want to stay at home, physical assistance like getting in and out of chairs even, or using walkers, physiotherapy, this type of thing, all that's improving. I have a sister who's quite disabled, and she didn't want to leave her own home, so she had a lift installed instead of a stair lift. It's a proper lift that will take her wheelchair. Now, comparatively speaking, to enable her to stay at home, it means she can get up to her bedroom, she can get to her bed. It cost £11,000, which, and it's guaranteed, obviously, and maintained and everything. Now, that compared to someone going into care, which she would have had to have done, she's a widow. So it's those types of technology, not just looking at, oh, can you do this and can you, it's actually physically, she's fortunate that mentally she's not too bad, physically she's quite bad. And I think also, to take your point, is that as people get older, people are becoming, the people that are coming old, like all of us, are, well, some not as much, is we're digitally competent anyway. I mean, I don't have one of these Fitbits, but I now go for a checkup at the hospital or the doctors. And whereas before they had all sorts of things, now they put something on your finger and it tells them virtually everything, and something sometimes more than they need to know. But so I think we have to be aware that looking at the assistance now, from being able to open a can to be able to lift something, it's the whole gamut that will make people easier. And I know a number of 93-year-olds that are better on their computer than I am, and keep in touch. So, but it's excellent.
I think your chairman would benefit from technology, because if I can address I had obviously had a problem in reading my own notes. So if one just whip back over the page to communities and wellbeing savings, just for the record, I need to mention that we had received a written question from Dr. Ireland, and members have been circulated with the question and the response. So I just want to make it on record that I have brought it to the committee's attention. I know they've had copies and read it, but I had a great big note on my sheet which I clearly ignored, so I clearly need help already. So if we can come back to the agenda, and we're now on paragraph 60 to 83.
Paragraph 6283 just outline the policy context as set out in the NHS long-term plan for the future direction of health services, and of course health and social care integration is part of that. Committee sheet will note the County Council Cabinet report in February 19, which summarised the content of the NHS plan and the implications for the Council. Clearly there's a lot of work going on locally within the NHS to start to prepare to become an integrated care service by 2021, which is set out within the NHS long-term plan. Those care arrangements will obviously change the nature of the relationships that we have with our colleagues in the NHS, but it is clear that we are a strategic partner and we would want to see further integration, particularly concentrated at what we call the neighbourhood and place level, which is essentially the neighbourhood is the care that people receive from their GP and their integrated team that should sit around the GP, so that should be health, social care, other colleagues, and at the place level, which is the level of the county council. So though it goes back to the conversation we had around communities and how we develop communities, and the county council's contribution into developing what we call place level services, but essentially services that support people in their local communities. So that's just around the future of those services. The Better Care Fund is the financial means to support that development. It's been in place since 2014-15. It consists of a pooled budget, which the clinical commissioning groups and the county council both commit funding to. The county council contribution comes through what's called the Improved Better Care Fund, the IBCF, which is was established around 3 years ago now. The contributions in the Better Care Fund are outlined at paragraph 74. So as you can see, the CCG contribution is by far the largest amount. Part of that contribution is what's called a minimum allocation to sustain adult social care. So this is the amount that the government, let's say nationally, the CCG, must commit to the delivery of social care. That's outlined at paragraph 75. But in addition to that, there is a further tranche of funding which has been agreed locally. Clearly, any reduction to funding around the Better Care Fund would have a significant impact on the County Council's budget, and particularly on the adult and communities budget. So if you look at our overall total budget of £143 million, the contribution we get through the BCF and the IBCF is substantial and accounts for a good amount of our current spend. In terms of the future plans for the Better Care Fund, we know that the government have announced that the current Better Care Fund will be rolled over for a further 12 months into 2021. The current Better Care Fund plan came to an end last year, but the government have announced that it will be rolled over. We understand that there is work taking place to review both the governance of the Better Care Fund and the outcomes that are derived from it, and we expect that those reviews will take place between spring and summer of this year, and we anticipate there being a further 3-year programme, probably with a different title, probably with some different performance indicators and metrics around it. So we'll have to gear up for a whole new kind of process, but we expect that the funding itself will continue in some form or other.
Thank you, John. I'm going to be bold and ask if you'd also do paragraphs 84 and 85, then I'll invite members to comment on this section and on the revenue part of the budget in general, should they wish to.
Sorry, paragraph 84, which is entitled Other External Influences, or might be titled Other Risks to MTFS Delivery, essentially just details 2 or 3 areas where we know that there are further changes coming down the line in terms of policy or legislation, such as the new Deprivation of Liberty Safeguard, the review of the Mental Health Act, the introduction of the new national living wage and the increase that was announced recently to take place from April, and the fact that the Care Act changes that were due to come into force never have, and the government have announced that they will bring forward a plan for social care. So those things all have an impact on the MTFS over the period, the 4-year period, and we might expect that those will have to be factored into future MTFS discussions. And then paragraph 85 just details, when we talked earlier about the revenue budget and we said that there were various grants and income amounting to £98 million. Some of those grants are detailed here for committees' information, so some of the larger elements of those funds are just detailed under paragraph 85 for information.
Mr. Mayor.
Cheers, thank you. Just looking at the other sort of funding sources, I think there tend to be one-off funding, and then we've got the budget, the first budget of this new government in March. Have you had any communications, not you personally, but through local government, of what's going to happen to adult social care and adult social care funding going forward?
All the grants listed in paragraph 85, we have had reasonable confidation that they'll continue into 2021, but beyond that there is still a gap and unknown about what will happen. So
Mrs. Wright.
Are we going to the Care Act and the review expected in 2020? Well, we're there in 2020 now. I mean, there was talk in the Care Act before about a cap on care, cap on accommodation, individual care account starting. So that would reduce really the support the self-funders are giving to the residential care market. And it's just, I suppose I'm asking you if you've got a crystal ball really, but to say what sort of impact that would have on us, and are we prepared if something like that is introduced again?
Well, without looking into the crystal ball, I'll look backwards because I've got more certainty about what happened in the past rather than what might happen in the future. Certainly when we were preparing for this in 2015, we did do some analysis of the care market at that time, and on the levels of provision that we would need in order to manage such a situation. I think there are two main areas of additionality. The first, for the council, the first is, as you say, if you put a cap on the individual levels of payments for care, then the state has to intervene at an earlier point, and therefore the demand on the local authority to meet residential care costs increases, and we did do some work at that time. We'd have to update it for today's current prices and for what we expect to happen in terms of the numbers of people going into care. And it would be significant. I mean, it would be very, very significant, and it would require certainly addition. It would be seen as a new burden for local government, and the government would have to pay for it and fund it. The second element is that we would, in order to implement such a system, we would have to assess everybody who goes into care, not just the 30% that we currently assess, but the 70% who fund their own care. So that would mean that we would have to potentially double and triple the amount of assessments that we undertake, both care assessments and financial assessments. And therefore, we would have to employ a lot more staff. So the actual cost of delivery would also increase. In terms of whether that's going to be brought forward in the government's plan that's going to be announced, we simply don't know. I read an article this morning that one of the government's policy advisors is suggesting that care home fees should be paid as a national payment, as a national tariff payment, so taken out of the hands of local authorities altogether. So they'd still expect us to manage it, they still expect us to be responsible for assessing people and for ensuring the quality of care, but the actual payment of the fee would be done nationally, as it is through the NHS. That's one alternative. I think most people think now there has to be a different balance of taxation and individual responsibility, but what balance that? Yeah.
All right, thank you for that, John. We're now on to the last stage, which is paragraphs 86 to 87, Appendix D, which is the capital programme.
Thank you. Yes, so the capital programme is detailed on paragraph 86. As you'll see, the total capital programme is £13 million over the 4-year period, half of which is accounted for through the Disabled Facilities Grant, which comes through the BCF and is passported to the district council and borough councils. So that's 3.9 million a year over the 4 years. The main schemes that are subject to the County Council discretionary capital programme are listed in paragraph 87. All of these have been previously reported through committee, so none of these are new. So we've got the Records Office relocation, the development of the Hamilton Court Smith Crescent site, the refurbishment of the Trees Residential Care Home, and the Social Care Investment Programme, which we've previously talked about. And then on paragraph 88, we've just listed some future possible capital developments, which is phase 2 of the Collections Hub, further investment into the Social Care Investment Programme, and potentially, if we do take forward some new ways of working through the use of digital, then we obviously may need to buy some new equipment and additional equipment if we're going to take that forward as a means of providing care and support.
Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Chairman. It's possible I've missed it. Well, obviously I've missed it, but 87 little c, the trees refurbishment, have we got a proposed start time for that, and have we got a time scale of how long that will take?
Yes, it has been delayed, so to be fair, we were anticipating that we might have been further progressed than we are, but certainly we are now in that development phase. The people who live and are resident at the trees have moved to alternative accommodation in order to allow us to go on site. The works have been signed off. The building work is due to take place, I think completion is likely by the end of the summer.
Sorry, the chairman's been very remiss as well, so could I also take the opportunity to thank Judith Spence for coming, who's our finance business partner, and her contribution to this. I think broadly, if I take on to what members have said and asked, I think we're all comfortable with the budget as it is. I think the two messages we'd ask a cabinet member to take back is obviously because of the potential greater impact for the living wage on this area, that obviously the central budget for such things needs to make sure it includes that, which I'm sure it does from my conversation with the finance portfolio holder. And secondly, that as Will, that the portfolio holder shares with the cabinet our concerns about the severe impact that future changes that central government might make could have on this. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just if you share our concerns that it's in the back of our mind if it happens. And if I could thank everybody who's been involved in putting this together. But I think one thing it does evidence is it shows how well I think this committee is briefed during the year, that I don't think it's lack of questions, it's because we had a lot of knowledge about what was happening, which informed us in what to ask on this. So if I can thank all members for their input on certainly many of these topics, things like the target operating model over the last 12 months. If we can now move to agenda item 9. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, going back to the trees, yes, as cabinet support, I went along to have a look at how it is now and looked at the plans for the proposals, and it looks like it's going to be really nice for the residents. So I'm hoping to go along when it's completed before they move back in, and it looks as though it's going to be a lovely establishment.
No, thank you, Christine. It's very useful. If we could take agenda item 9, which is the commissioning and procurement of home care services post-November 2020, and we've got Paul Sharp, Programme Manager, joining us, and I'm sure this is, I'm looking at John C, so Johnny's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Chair. As you say, Paul Sharp's joined us, so if there are any tricky technical questions or anything that might be challenging, Paul's here to answer those. I'll just kick off with a brief summary of the report. Committees received 2 previous reports in September and November, just to outline progress being made around the recommissioning of home care. Whilst the full specification is still being developed, and Paul and colleagues are working hard on that, I know, and there are some details yet to be finalised, the updated report you've got today provides a summary of the new model that we'll be looking to take forward and the approach to implementation. We've undertaken significant analysis of the current market, as well as taking on board learning from the previous procurement that we did around Help to Live at Home. And paragraphs 7 and 8 provides a sort of the summary learning and findings from that. So what we know is that the lead provider model didn't work as consistently and effectively as we'd like. The geographical lots are not currently consistent with natural operating areas. The pricing structure that we've got doesn't necessarily align with actual costs, particularly the differential between urban and rural costs in terms of provision. And we want to address those issues through the new process. We want to make sure that we continue to provide people with services that allow them to live independently. We want a very smooth transition to the new service, and we want a service that's going to be sustainable in the long term, but also flexible enough to meet people's needs in the short term. In order to address that, we will be working with, in the new contractual framework, probably a larger number of providers across the county. We have differentiated between urban and rural and isolated areas, and there's a new pricing structure that goes alongside that. So paragraph 15 sort of details how we've differentiated through urban, what we're calling fringe, which is the edges of the urban area, rural and isolated areas. We want to ensure that wherever possible we create a sustainable home care service. We want to address issues around terms and conditions for care workers. So we would like providers to be paying the real living wage, not just the living wage, but the real living wage. And we'd like to see that providers are paying HMRC rates for mileage and paying transport and travel times within all of their contracts. So that provides us with a new pricing structure, and as you can see on paragraph 20, we've detailed what that might look like, but there is further work taking place as we speak, engaging with providers to check out that those prices that we've got in there will meet their real costs of care. The provider model, we will have two levels of provision. So there'll be prime providers and supplementary providers. That's not the same as the lead providers in the current contractual framework. Prime providers will be expected to pick up the majority of the work that's available to them within those zones that we are outlining. But there will also be supplementary providers who will have direct contracts with the county council. So it's not subcontracting. Supplementary providers will also have direct contracts with the county council to provide care. We want there to be at least 2 prime providers per zone. That gives us some level of sustainability and flexibility. But there'll be absolutely no limit and no restriction on the number of supplementary providers that can be within those zones and those contracts. We're proposing 14 zones, and we've detailed on paragraph 30 where those zones would be. So there'll be some large zones, some medium zones, some small zones, and one what's called a rural free zone, which is essentially an area, it says here Harborough, it's Harborough District as opposed to Harborough, Market Harborough. And it's an area where it is very difficult to purchase care. There's very few care providers, there's quite a sparse population, and we don't want to restrict or provide restrictions. We want to be as flexible as we possibly can, and Paul can go into the detail of what that might look like. Appendix A to C provide some more detail on the zones. In terms of timetables for decision, there is at paragraph 44 a timetable. Paul has just got an update to that, so I'll ask Paul in a minute just to update on that, because there's been 1 or 2 changes even since we wrote this report. Working collectively and jointly across the council and with the clinical commissioning groups means that governance processes do tend to have to be quite flexible. So I'll ask Paul to update on that. But in conclusion, we're trying to address, as I said, the key concerns that come out of the current contract. We're trying to take the learning from previous procurements. By presetting the price levels, we think that allows us to concentrate on quality in the evaluation of bids rather than price. So we're hoping that that allows providers to come back to us and share with us what their pricing structures need to be. As I said, we want to improve terms and conditions for care workers so that we can address some of the issues around turnover in the care market. So, an opportunity for committee to comment. The report there'll be a report to Cabinet seeking approval to procure in early February. So, there's an opportunity for committee to add any comments to the Cabinet report at this stage. Paul, do you want to just update on the governance?
So, the key differences to the timetable that you have in your report are on the 30th of January will now be the CCG Competition and Procurement Group. So that's, I think, a day out from what you had. Then there's a new group that sits between the Section 75 Partnership Agreement and the Cabinet decision, which is the CCG Integrated Governance and Quality Committee. That will sit on the 4th of February. And then there'll be a joint CCG governing body that will sit on the 11th of February. So that's because of all the changes that's going on currently within the CCGs. And then we've changed the sort of procurement start and end and implementation start and end dates to be a little bit more flexible, because effectively what we want to make sure is we've got robust preparations and we've got fully tested sort of solutions before we actually commit to going out to procurement. So it's not that we will necessarily go later, but we want, rather than specify an actual date, we've decided to put a range of dates in there with a not later than. So procurement will start not later than the 30th of April and end not later than the 31st of August, with implementation starting no later than the 1st of September, and will finish no later than the 30th of October 21, which is at the end of the second extension period to help to live at home if we extend to that point.
could I just suggest, Paul, that perhaps if an email could go out to committee members with those dates sometime? I mean, no urgency, but just so members have them. Mr. Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. One should, of course, applaud the ambition of enhancing the care profession. I'm just curious, how would we know that our improved mechanism is actually migrating its way to the actual members of staff and in their pay packet?
Partly through introduction of new KPIs where they've got to measure and report on staff remuneration, but also we're in discussions with internal audit around how we can actually implement an audit process to ensure that that is actually taking place.
Mrs. Wright.
I look forward to that one, Chair. Thank you.
Oh gosh. My question really is about, you mentioned about lessons learnt, and it's around the procurement side of it and the implementation and the phases, because we're saying we're going to stabilise one phase before moving on to another phase, and we're saying we're tested solutions, and I'm just interested, what are the tested solutions and how we ensure that one phase is stabilised, because you know it's an open market. If somebody drops out or something, how we fill that gap, because it's really important to the people who are using the service.
First of all, in terms of testing, what we're actually trying to do is test predominantly how the systems will cope with the new service and the current service alongside each other, and making sure that we can transition from one to the other quite easily. In terms of how the phasing will work and to what level of stabilisation is needed, really largely depends on who the successful bidders are. So if, for example, a lot of our current providers are successful going forwards, then that move across from old to new will be simpler than if it was total new providers. And again, depending on where we start, depends on, again, if some existing providers, for example, bid unsuccessfully, whether they want to exit the market quickly or whether they're prepared to hold the business that they've got and we transition new business only. So that's why, as John said, we're currently working at the detail of a lot of how that phasing does, and why we've extended or potentially extended those implementation dates to make sure that we've got a robust process as can be possibly done in the time that is available.
Richard, you want to come at the end? Right, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Chair. I think this committee, myself on this committee originally, and then Mac, were highly critical when the Help to Live at Home went belly up, let's say, or got into trouble. So I was interested to see how you would remodel, and then interested to read how you have actually gone ahead and done it. And to be fair to everybody involved in it, I quite like this proposal. And I think, if I make some general comments first, Chair, I think it's well thought out. I think you've realised the mistakes that were made in the original procurement in the Help to Live at Home. The zonal thing that's come in is excellent, and I think you've realised that urban locations and rural locations are different settings and very difficult to recruit in urban locations, and so we have to pay a bit more. But also I think what we've learned is that we've looked at everything as a whole before we're going to launch it, and I think the soft testing or doing it slowly is excellent, and doing it in certain zones rather than all at once like the Big Bang is to be applauded. I have a few questions, but overall I don't think I can fault anything in there at this moment, and hopefully it is successful, because at the end of the day it's the people that we care for that this will affect, not me sitting around this table or yourself sitting over there, and they're the ones that we let down in 3 years ago-ish. So if I go to my first question on number 20, which is the rates that you've set for the urban, the fringe, the rural and the isolated, how have you benchmarked that, and are those realistic amounts?
Basically, this is where Care Analytics have done a lot of work and done a lot of correspondence with existing providers to understand their current rates of business, current costs, etc. And then we've factored in things like the real living wage. So there's an enormous amount of work which is way above my capability in terms of explaining the technicalities of what they've done. But we brought in Care Analytics because they were a market-leading organisation that's done this in several other areas within the country.
The follow-on question for that one is, we provide some of the care in Leicestershire, but the NHS provide care as well, and they used to pay rates that were higher than us originally. Have we now closed this gap? We will be able to get...
This is a jointly commissioned, so we're commissioning on behalf of ourselves and Health and NHS. So these contracts will be across both for ourselves and for CCG colleagues. There may still be elements of provision which are outside of these contracts. I spoke earlier about some specialised areas of service that we're looking to develop on top of this core contract. So some of those things might be around, as I said earlier, the nighttime needs, and that might be done on a county-wide basis as opposed to a zonal basis. There might be specialist areas in terms of things like, you know, we need to do some work, think about whether we want to have a specialist dementia home care service. There will be end-of-life care that will be specialist, and the CCGs and Health and NHS will maybe contract for some of those things separately, and they may well pay more because they may need a specialised service. Brain injury could be another area where you need specific skilled expertise, and Health might, you know, pay in addition to that. But in terms of the core general home care services, these will be across both health and social care, and it'll be the same rates that are paid for both.
And one final question, Chair, if you allow me, and it's on paragraph 42 on page 43. And I think on the old Help to Live at Home, where we fell down is, I think we tried to save money, and massive amount of money, £1 million a year, I think it was. Whereas here, I think we're recognising that actually care costs, and we have to pay the going rate and the market rate to not only pay the people who are on the front line who provide the care, but also attract the care providers to be sustainable and a little bit profit. Let's use that word, but also to recognise that, you know, care at the moment is minimum wage job, and turnover is high, and support care providers are going out of business, and new ones are entering, and that's not ideal. So recognising that it's going to cost money, and we're budgeting for that, that's sensible, I think. Thank you.
Mr. Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just... Great thing about scrutiny is you can ask questions and dig in. So I'm just slightly curious. So you mentioned the level of KPIs and the governance procedure for our care providers. So presumably somewhere along the line, if there is a concern with a care provider, whatever that concern is, we would adopt some form of improvement notice mechanism. And that's all well and good until you reach a point when it's time to terminate that agreement, where they could be having, you know, 300 of our residents under their wing, and all of a sudden we've got a capacity problem because you're terminating the contract with provider C. So I'm just curious what the sort of thinking and methodology is, how you would actually accommodate should a situation arise where you're terminating one of our agreements.
I mean, one of the things we've put into this is that we have an open agreement, so we can bring new providers on stream if we need to throughout the duration of the contract. The other thing that I think helps that is we've got a far more fluid mix between different size providers, so we're setting out to have more small and medium-sized providers than we originally intended with Help to Live at Home. So we've got more fluidity there should there be surges and restrictions in supply. The whole process as well of watching and monitoring what they're doing gives us the opportunity to move prime providers ultimately down from being prime providers into being supplementaries and promote upwards as well. So we will constantly monitor the quality of the service that they're delivering and adjust accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry, can I just add to that? I think it's also worth noting that we have existing processes in place by which we have contractual discussions and negotiations, sometimes leading to contract suspensions and terminations. They happen all the time. Well, terminations don't happen all the time. Conversations happen all the time. No. Conversations happen all the time. I mean, just to give you an example, there will have been probably between 4 and 6 of those conversations in the last 12 months, and we manage them, and we manage, where required, transfer of care to a new provider. Hopefully people don't hear about it, people don't see it. Hopefully it happens behind the scenes and people's care continues, and we'd expect that to be the case. So we have a quality improvement team, we have a contracts team. They work very hard with providers to try and sustain the provision wherever possible, but where that's not possible, we do have conversations with providers around their future and whether or not they can continue to provide in the market.
Very quickly, Les, if you're coming back.
Just one final sort of question, having sort of lived through the system some years ago. The new pathways, the new providers, the new standards of operating, and are you mentioned kind of the more specialised areas, but there's also non-specialised but high dependency or high demand. Do we have arrangements in place with some of our providers that, I'm not going to go into details of my mother, but she was a high demand. It wasn't particularly, there's no brain injury, but she was just difficult to manage in her residential flat. So I'm just curious, is there some sort of mechanism where we have some providers who are prepared to take on those very high dependency service users?
I think we would expect that all of our providers, and certainly the prime providers, should have the ability to do that. And that would certainly be something that we'd be looking to see within the tenders that come back in and the part of the evaluation. Obviously, sometimes that requires additional carers, so it might. Sometimes it's not, as you say, it's not just sort of specific expertise, but you might need to provide a higher degree of care. You might need more carers going in on a more frequent basis, so you have to be flexible about that. Sometimes, people to a greater and lesser degree are able to accept care, and not everybody finds that very easy. So I think most of our providers are aware of that. And certainly we are happy to work with providers, and we have teams that work within the county council that can help providers with things like challenging behaviour, for example. So we can train providers around that sort of thing, and we provide support to providers.
Mike?
Thank you, Chair. I suppose it might be something that has been taken into account, but I'm just thinking that historically in some of the conversations that we've had, carers aren't paid to travel. So when they're moving from one appointment to another, they're not paid for that period of time. And whilst they might be getting their expenses paid, that they're losing money. So with regards to the new procurement, given the fact that kind of then impacts on the care and the amount of time they're spending with patients, service users, is that something that's been considered, or is it just a reality of the practice?
Now that's part of what's being considered, and part of the current or next phase of discussions with providers is we're asking how sustainable they think that sort of approach is, and part of the whole ethos of trying to get care to the outlying regions without it being an unsustainable sort of business, both from their point of view and from the actual workers' point of view.
Mr. Crooks?
Thank you, Chairman. I think part of my question's just been answered, actually. In my own area, in our village, there's a young lady who does care and has done for a number of years, and very rarely complains about the finance side of it. What she does complain about is the time she's allowed from one site to another, and sometimes it can be a number of miles when it's in real rural areas like where I come from. And basically she says that she hasn't literally got time to put the full time in with the residents. She, you know, it's took up in travelling, and doesn't matter how much she moans about it, it's not altered, you know. They're after making it pay, sort of thing. I'll just wonder, I think part of the question's been answered, but I'd just like to reinforce that we do need to, you know, keep an eye on that.
Thank you, Mr. Crooks. I think it's more a statement. I think I'd echo a lot of what Mr. Mears said, in that I think this is an excellent report. I think it's clear that this has been discussed at this committee several times, that the officers and have taken on board the comments that we've made. I think, you know, where I disagree with Mr. Mears is, I think to use phrases like "it went belly up last time" actually are wrong, because I do believe that this council managed it efficiently, very professionally, and not to the detriment of our patients in a difficult situation. So I can't personally accept phrases like that. I think we have learnt from our experience, and we have a developing plan which is getting better each time we look at procurement. So I'd echo that and thank the officers for the work they put into this, and for taking on board our comments, and for taking us through this. And I'd invite Richard now to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if I shared this before, but the reason I'm here is because of this going wrong. It went wrong badly last time, emergency cabinet meeting, and I thought this is a real mess. This is reputationally really bad for this council. I was working with John doing museums and libraries, which were busy at that time, less busy now, thankfully. And I thought this is a challenge. And all I said, Joel, thank you very much indeed for how you started the meeting. Really was the sort of thing, having gone through it with you before, that I wanted to hear from you, because that means that you can appreciate as a neutral what we did. And apart from the language that the chairman pointed out for, I think actually overall, yeah, well, it was the only bit you dipped below the line, but otherwise it was constructive criticism. Picking up Mr. Fillimore on the right there, I think the way I'd sum it up really is what you see in here is all the things we've learnt in the last period. That doesn't mean that means we will have it right at the next one. This is incredibly fluid. As John pointed out, sometimes we get on our lead member meetings a new hot situation that could be hours old, a few days old, and we have to find a pragmatic solution. That's what we've done quietly along the way, and it's worked. So this is the best that we can cast at the moment based on what we've learned. Something else will go wrong that hasn't gone wrong before in the past. Everybody knows it's a tight model. We know that but I think changing the geographic areas, it's full of common sense solutions. It's listening actually to the providers and the users and everybody else, and trying to get rid of the problems that Mr. Crooks was just mentioning earlier about travel time and things like that, and the rural areas being different to the semi-rural areas, and no longer doing district boundaries. You know, there are daft things really we were doing before. It seemed sensible, so we've learned some lessons, but things may go wrong in the future. But this is the best we can cope at the moment. It's been a very interesting process, and I'm hopeful, Chairman.
Thank you for that, Richard, and thank you, Paul, for your contribution as well. We're now moving on to the final agenda item for today, which is National Performance Benchmarking 2018-19 and Performance Report 2019-20, and position as at November 2019. And I knew that by the time I'd got all through that, Matt Williams, our business partner, would have joined us. And I think John's sitting back, so it must be Matt who's doing it all.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, this is the report. Slight difference to the report that I usually bring here, in the sense that it comes in the two parts, really. First is the benchmarking, and that's of the financial year 2018-19. And secondly, and perhaps the more traditional elements of the report, an update on the recent performance covering the period April to November. So I'll start with the benchmarking element. The report includes comparative information from a variety of publications. Firstly, the Council was ranked the most productive for the third year running by Empower. From an adult care perspective, we were ranked in the top 10 authorities for areas relating to older people, all age disability, and also the interface between health and social care. The Care Quality Commission publication on standards showed that for nursing care and home care, the proportion of Leicestershire's providers rated as outstanding or good was higher than the national average, whereas the proportion for residential providers was slightly lower. There were no providers in Leicestershire, however, assessed as being inadequate. The Local Government Association Use of Resources analysis showed that activity-wise, there was no particular areas where Leicestershire was an outlier. From a cost perspective, the gross cost per service user in Leicestershire was lower for adults aged 18 to 64 when compared nationally with East Midlands or with the similar authorities. With regards to support for those aged 65 and over, the gross cost per service user in Leicestershire was considerably lower than that of the other comparable areas. Moving on to the Adult Social Care Outcomes Framework, which is where our main indicators lie. There are 29 metrics in the framework in 2018-19, 5 more than the previous year due to the inclusion of the biennial carers survey. Overall, the position was not too dissimilar to 2017-18, with roughly half the metrics in the top 2 quartiles and the other half in the bottom 2 quartiles. Supporting people to gain or gain independence was a strong area of performance. This includes reablement services, accommodation and levels of employment. Working with the NHS to keep delayed transfers of care low was another strong area of performance. It is clear that feedback gathered via service user and to a slightly lesser extent carers surveys remains a challenging area of performance. 13 of the 29 metrics in ASCOF are based on such feedback and 9 were below the national average, with 6 actually being in the bottom quartile. These include areas such as social contact, control over daily life and finding information. As noted in the report, there is a programme of work underway dedicated to understanding and ultimately improving the feedback we receive. The CIPFA analysis of libraries activity is the final area of benchmark included in the report. The levels of active borrowers and physical visitors are in the bottom quartile, as are the number of book loans. These will have been impacted during the year to an extent by the temporary closures to convert libraries to smart libraries, a work which will enable a further additional 30 hours of access. Issues in electronic format continue to grow, and in 2018-19 the rate per head of population was just short of the national average. So turning our attention to the latest position and an update as at the end of November 2019. Overall performance is generally good, and the majority of metrics are on track to either maintain or to improve on the previous year's performance. Examples of good areas of performance include a considerable increase in the number of hours of volunteering at the council-run libraries and also the heritage sites. We also have a high proportion of people aged 18 to 64 with learning disabilities living in settled accommodation. Moving on to a couple of examples where performance could be improved. Firstly, visitors to heritage sites between April and November was noted as being 3% lower than the same period of the previous year. And the number of older people being placed into permanent residential or nursing homes between April and November was higher than wished and currently off track for meeting the target. In summary then, the benchmark in 2018-19 highlights varying degrees of performance, from strong positions in relation to regaining independence, efficiency and effectiveness, and the more challenging area of feedback. For 2019-20, the performance to date has been good, with the majority of metrics set to meet the target. We welcome any questions or comments from members of the committee. Thank you.
Mr. Bremner.
When you say you got a problem with feedback, is that literally giving people an online survey or a paper survey and you just get a low response rate?
It's actually a paper survey. We have to follow national guidelines, so all local authorities do the same, right down to the letter, the covering letter, the questionnaire, exactly the same. We have a good response rate. We're expected, we have a set target to meet for NHS England, and again we meet that, that's fine. So those areas of return rate is not a problem, and as I said, we have to do it via a paper copy and a kind of reminder letter 3 weeks later should we not have had a return.
What is your problem then with the feedback? Is it the content of the feedback you get? It's not full enough for you to make an interpretation of what they're trying to say?
Well, again, really we are delivering the requirements of the national position on this. So the questions asked in the questionnaire are set at a national level, and we put them out. So an example of an area where we struggle is a question around how much social contact people feel they receive. And they get, if I remember rightly, they get about 4 answers to choose from they get all the social contact they would like, to they get enough, and another 2 slightly less there. I think it's worth pointing out that in terms of the national analysis and the actual metrics within the framework, it's just the top answer that counts, i.e. people are getting all the social contact they want. What we're not saying is that we have a response that is low down that list of not having anything. It's just not the top line. So that when we then rank ourselves with other local authorities, they're hitting the top line more often than we are, and we are ranked much lower. Hope that kind of explains it. Happy to go through it again if that helps.
Just a comment. Surveys are a funny thing, and sometimes you know of Spurgeon's, but sometimes you wonder if some authority's getting the high mark from a survey response. If you've got a 5 and they're putting it at number 5 all the you wonder if they're putting some influence in there. Because psychology of a survey generally is people won't necessarily go to the extremes of very good or very bad. They'll go in the middle, and the middle's negative. And that's the problem with any survey. Not quite sure how you overcome that if it's a government-led survey, though.
This is a good point, and yes, it is a government survey. It is something that we've been grappling with for a year or 2 now, trying to understand why people in Leicestershire are perhaps choosing that second answer down, which, as I said, isn't particularly saying, in the example I've given, that social contact is poor. It's just not, the very best it could be. So yes, we are trying to understand that, and we've, as explained in the report, we have a dedicated officer now looking into this in some more detail.
Mr. Mayor, but only if you ask the top question.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I just want to touch on libraries, smart libraries. We're investing money on them. Are we getting people in there, and how many, and what's the trend when nobody's there, basically the smart times? Because I'm worried about the figures that you've stated for visits include web visits, and I really don't think they're visits personally. Maybe they could be separated out so we can see the trend of people actually physically visiting the libraries and virtually visiting the libraries. Maybe those 2 figures, and then we can find out which way they're going. But if we're investing all these money in smart libraries, and then there's another 2 in the budget to convert this year, just wanted to see how the trend was.
We haven't yet done any specific trends on that. It's still relatively early, you could say, within the transition. I don't know whether the department got any plans to bring a report here, etc., on smart libraries, but it's something that we haven't yet. I understand the position you've noted with regards to the web visits, and we can separate those out. That's not a problem.
This is right.
It's just a question really around the statistical age of people that we're referring to. So we're putting in people in bands, people aged 65 or over, when really society is changing because of the change of pension ages. They're moving out. So over 65 now, it's moving to 66, 67. And I'm just wondering how that sort of skews figures when we've got an element of people still having to work now over 60, especially women, and then 65 is moving out to 67 or 66, 67. But we just we're on the old ones, and I don't know whether there's any plans to move it or.
Again, we're committed to what the national requirements are for the indicators, which are set at 18 to 64 and 65 and over. However, we are doing some work just as we speak, actually, about looking particularly at residential care, the use of nursing care, residential care, and breaking that down further into a more detailed set of age groups, so 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85 and over, to give you a better look at it, because you're right, it's quite a wide range, 65 and over.
Mike?
Thank you, Chair. All right, Matt. It's good to put a face to the name. It really was just kind of making a point that actually virtually Matt and I have been communicating around how Healthwatch can kind of offer a little bit of a secondary way of support. If people want to ask about the survey and have a bit of an independent chat around it, then we're actually going to start putting Healthwatch's contact details for members of the public to contact. And I suppose there's a wider question which I think we could probably have offline about how we could maybe kind of offer some more support given the kind of extensive and ongoing engagement and outreach we tend to do on a daily basis, and actually just be asking people the question about, if you receive social care, have you seen the survey? What do you think of the survey? Is it just like the GP survey where people get it and go, yeah, thanks very much, and suffers the same kind of level of apathy that most surveys get, where you get a very low response rate? So yeah, I've just kind of saw your name and went, Matt, oh yeah. So,
well, clearly there's a queue forming at Matt's desk once the meeting is finished, but okay then, Paul.
Just one thought was, if you put the survey out, a survey for a member of the public, if they do a survey, what is the response and what action has occurred because of their response in the survey, or response from the overall feeling from the survey? Do you communicate to the public on a sort of annual basis when the survey is put out what has changed as a result of the survey? So it gives them an incentive to do.
Yes, one of the leaving the survey as it is written by the government. It asks, would you like feedback from the survey? And some people put yes, please, and will leave their name and address. And we send a fold-up brochure of kind of headline information back to them, and just give an explanation of where this goes. So again, it's put back to the national government. They publish the full details. We've never gone into the full. I mean, we are quite early on in the programme of work looking at feedback and how we can improve it. So we have never put anything like that in it. It was 12 months ago since we've last done this. The next survey goes out in early February.
All right, thank you, Matt. If you let Dr. Bremner have the minister's name, he'll be queuing up outside his door. I mean, valid points, and you're constrained by central government. I think it's one of those things that's always puzzled us, but we are where we are. Could I thank you, Matt, for that? Could I also take the opportunity of thanking John, Richard and Christine for their input into this meeting. You'll be pleased to know that we've finished. The date of the next meeting is the 9th of March 2020 at 2 o'clock. There are no urgent items, so thank you for your attendance and input.